Well, we're here today from the BYU Library Family History Center. These presentations will be posted to our video channel on the YouTube and as well as the website for the Family History Library. And we are glad to have everyone here. This topic, why did someone change my grandmother? And in the case of reacting to changes in the FamilySearch family tree, it's very hard to say too much about this. I've written about it. I've had webinars and classes about it for as long as the family tree's been in existence, and it's always been an interesting question. And so this is what we're going to talk a little bit about, and we'll get moving here. Well, let's start with your grandmother. I might as well go straight into the issue, and that is something that's we should work on. So here's my thought. If someone is changing your grandmother, and what we need, I mean, you're not going to change it. Maybe they do. Sometimes people put in different people sometimes. And I'm not talking about great, 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 great grandmothers going back. We'll get to that issue in a little while here. But even if you were the only child of an only child, and there's something very important that you need to know, and that is you have living relatives. It would be extremely unusual that you are the only living person in a line. It's not impossible, but it does, even if that was the case, you would still have a multitude of cousins out there that are in the second, third, fourth, and fifth cousin range, for example, which are related to you, would be probably exploring the family tree and finding you and your relatives, and may very well have information that is different than what you have put and entered in, or someone else entered in at one point in time. And so that's really what we're trying to get to, is that this is not something that's unusual. It is not a bug or a problem or an issue with the program, FamilySearch program. The basic statement that I make whenever that question comes up is that the problem is not the FamilySearch program. There's nothing wrong with FamilySearch. And even if you are the only child of an only child, you're still going to have people who are relatives who are going to be making changes. And we'll explain how that happens and why. So now we're going to get into kind of the detail here. I need to start by going back. And the first thing I have to say is that the days of paper genealogy have long passed. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't still a lot of people out there who rely on keeping their records on paper and use paper notes and records and all sorts of things. My common statement is I don't do paper. I don't even like to be given a paper handout because I'm not going to be able to find it after I've got it in my hand. It's not going to be any good to me because I can't incorporate that information easily into the things that I need to do. And in fact, if I'm given an invitation or a note about a meeting, I immediately have to enter that into my computer because otherwise it will not be in my stream of things that I need to do each day. So there's a point here where one of the things that I think was characteristic of this was back in the days when I was frequently going to the Family History Library in Salt Lake City. And I would get there before it would open, or a few, not a long time before it opened, but a few minutes before it would open. And there would be, usually is, and I'm assuming there still is today, a crowd of people outside waiting for the library to open. And many of these people were pulling briefcases on wheels. Some of them had suitcases on wheels, and that was their paper and all of their information that they had to go through. And as I began helping people, now I've been, many, many years over the years helping people. I'm always kind of cringe when I have to help somebody with a big pile of paper, because inevitable that I'm going to ask some questions and they're going to spend most of their time trying to dig through the paper to find the answers, or to go back and see what they've done. And so it's just a fact of life. And the fact of life here with genealogy and everything else, that change is constant. You just have to get used to the idea that things are going to change. and that they're changing rapidly. They're changing more rapidly today than they ever will. And I can, before we started this class, we were talking about artificial intelligence and then the effect that it's having. And I can assure you that artificial intelligence is going to have a dramatic and fundamental effect on genealogy and on methodology, where the way you do your genealogy is going to change just dramatically. It's already started to change. MyHeritage has incorporated artificial intelligence into their search engine, and you can do your searches using artificial intelligence chatbot on MyHeritage now out of their more than 20 billion records. And so things are going to keep changing. And that's just the way that life is. And it's almost impossible if you want to resist the change, because as genealogy changes, what is happening in the larger genealogy community, meaning the worldwide genealogy community, will start to have a greater and greater impact on what you do as an individual and how you go about finding additional information. And there's always the same counterclaims. They say, well, not all the documents are digitized. Well, that's true. But at the rate they're being digitized, it's possible that most of the documents that you're looking for will be digitized. Now, they're not going to be on the major genealogical websites, but they may be on thousands and thousands of websites across the web. But see, that creates the situation of having to know how to navigate and do searches that will supplement your genealogical research. Just because you put things on paper or you put them into a separate program, like a desktop program, you can't really isolate yourself from either genealogical or technological changes. It just doesn't do you any good to do that, because the effect of this idea of I can keep my records and I don't need anybody else to look at them, or I don't need to be involved in the greater genealogical online community. The idea there is that you're going to end up doing a tremendous amount of duplicate work. Just you think you're isolated, that you're the only person in the world that is going to be looking at this particular line. And the problem you have in making any kind of a generalization is that there's always somebody who claims to be the exception. They say, well, there's nobody out there that gives, and I say, well, if you had a DNA test, no, I don't need a DNA test, because I'm finding my people. I don't need a DNA test. Well, the answer is you don't know how isolated you are and how your attitude, but whether you have any kind of a connection out there until you get a DNA test and put it on one of the only two large sites that basically will do that with family trees is large enough to make a difference. And that's Ancestry and MyHeritage. And if you have it on both of theirs, you can have tens of thousands of DNA matches. And it's just that everyone's interconnected, and we're living in this interconnected, related world that's becoming more and more obvious the more that genealogical research is involved with DNA. So what's the person? Why is this appropriate to talk about when we're talking about the changes in the FamilySearch family tree? Well, there's a lot of other things that are important to understand. You don't own your own genealogy. There's no ownership idea here of genealogical information. Because you are related to so many other people, as you go back to your great-grandparents and your great-great-grandparents and your great-great-great-grandparents and on back, you're part of a huge number of people that the further back you go, and I'll repeat this as we go along, the further back you go in your lines, your direct lines back, the more possibility is that there are descendants of those people, your cousins, that are related to you and are going to become involved in your particular part of your particular pedigree going back in time. And so if you think you own your family tree when you create a family tree, you own it jointly with thousands of other people who are descendants from those people as you go back in time. And then there's another claim. Another claim is many times people will say, well, I own it because I did the work. And so if you change what I do, then you're changing my work, and it's my work and I own it. And I have a work product. Well, the term work product doesn't have any kind of legal significance outside of the legal profession. It just doesn't exist. The only things that protect people's work are things like copyright. And in the academic world, of course, we have attribution and things like that involve acknowledging people who are the first or the discoverers or the originators of a certain idea or thing. But you really can't copyright an idea, and you can't copyright genealogy because it's facts, it's historical fact. And even if there were some kind of claim to what you have done in genealogical research, most of the countries of the world have a time limit on the expansion of their copyright laws. So when you go back in genealogy, it would be very quickly you would get back in the United States back before the 1920s, and nothing that would be there published would be covered by any conceivable copyright law in the United States. So you're basically not working with something that you own. It's something that's collaboratively if there is a sense of ownership, it's through your relationships. It's part of all of the relationships that exist on the family tree. Now, when you get that into your head, then we come to the essence of what's going on here. And there's one other step that you need to be aware of, and that's that dead people don't have any privacy. They don't have any claims to privacy. In other words, this information that you put into the family tree is in no way private. Living people have some privacy protections. Going back to about 1960s, there are some privacy. But right now, for example, we have the 1950 US Census, which is public domain. Anyone can look at it. Anybody can copy it or use it. It's in the National Archives, and it's on just about every large website out there. And there's living people on the 1950 census. I'm in the 1950 census. And so when you have that kind of understanding of the universality of this genealogy, and that you're related to everybody else, everybody's related, nobody has any greater claim of priority or right or ownership to any of the information that we're looking for as far as genealogy is concerned. Now, if you wrote a book about your ancestors and you copyrighted that book, the information would not be copyright protected. Your book might be copyright protected. The parts that were your original work might be copyright protected, but the information about your ancestors is not copyright protected. And so what happens is people confuse these concepts of ownership, of entitlement, and to privacy as somehow applying to the greater genealogical community, which it does not. So we're basically going to have to see how this works when you talk about the FamilySearch family tree. The FamilySearch tree was based on the concept of a wiki. It's not a pure wiki program. The wiki programs differ in some technical ways from the way that the family tree operates, but the basic concept of the family tree is essentially the same. And the ways that it is the same with all wikis out there is that it's collaborative. What that means in very straightforward, simple language is that everybody has a right, who is registered user of the family tree, to their part of the family tree. And their part of the family tree is part of the entire family tree. There is only one family tree. There's not your family tree and my family tree. There is everybody's family tree. So there's no ownership area. There's nothing that you own as an individual. It's so collaborative, and it's source-based. Now, this is something that's different, and the way it's been set up is different than some of the other wiki organizations. Like, you're getting into Wikipedia, you're getting into a whole bunch of things. If you do a search for wikis online, you'll find that there are hundreds, maybe thousands of wikis out there. So it's source-based. Now, what that means is it's a historical document. It's a reflection of the history. And the entries on the FamilySearch family tree are intended to be supported by valid, genealogically valuable historical sources. So to the extent that there's information in the family tree, you should be able to look at the sources and see whether the information is accurate or not accurate, at least when we're using the term accurate in a historical sense, that it is supported by the information in available historical records. So if the issue is whether a person was born in a certain year, then the question is what do the records, historical records say? It's not what your opinion is. It's not what you believe. It's not what's in your heart. It's not your feelings. It's nothing to do with that. It has to do with what the records reflect. Now, what if there's no record of a person's birth? Well, then you get into the object of making conclusions, and you can look through the records and conclude that a person was born at a certain date. But you have to then realize that other people could come through and look at the same records and make a different conclusion. And so being source-based and collaborative means that there's going to be changes. Somebody's going to come up with a different opinion than the one you have. And so that's going to be the situation where if you're not collaborating, if you're not participating in the ongoing back and forth on the family tree, then you're basically not working with the program. You're ignoring the basic concept of the program itself. And then this is a little bit repetitious, but what happens is that all the users have all rights to changing all the entries. So now we're back to the answer of the original question about the grandmother. Even though she is your grandmother, she's also probably a lot of other people's grandmother. If they're not, then she's somebody's cousin or somebody's aunt or somebody's whatever there is. And so there's just as much right on those people to make a change or to disagree with you on the details. But when we do that, we have to understand that we're going back to the source-based issue. So we're going to have to go through the process of evaluating the sources to see if the question is correct. And we'll talk a little bit about what happens if you don't use a source here in just a few minutes. And the other part of it is that users can search and navigate the entire tree. There are no boundary disagreements here. If you give me the name of some way to identify one of your direct line ancestors, your grandparents, I can type that into my family tree, to my part of the family tree, and I can go directly to your person and see exactly what's on that. The only thing you can't see is living people. So if you've marked someone living, then that is a sense of all I see is the word living. I don't see any kind of a person. I know there's a person in that position, but I don't know who that person is or have any access to that. So the boundary is the living versus the people who are dead. And the issue is that by making this completely open to everyone, then you have a way in which you're forced to be collaborative. Now, what does that mean? It means that because your great-grandfather or great-grandmother or great-great-grandfather or great-grandfather is maybe the same person as my great-great-grandfather, and we both have the right to search back to this person and edit those entries and look at that person. We can both make changes. And because we can both make changes, then we both live under the same set of rules. And so what happens if somebody violates the rules? Well, we get to that question. And It's important, though, to understand that the integrity of the tree, now, whether the tree is accurate as a whole, is the kind of question that cannot be answered. The question is not whether the tree as a whole is accurate. The only question is whether the individual entries on the tree are accurate. The more of the individual entries that are accurate, meaning reflect a valid source of historical information, a document or record of some kind that contain that information, the more of those there are, the more accurate the family tree. And literally the fact is that millions and millions of sources are being added every day, every year to the family tree. Millions. So as those sources are added and they're made available to people as attached to individuals, then the accuracy of the family tree becomes more and more stable. It becomes more believable, more popular, able to be depended upon. And so when you come to me and you say, they've changed this person and they're wrong, and what do I do about it? And then the answer is going to come back, you change and put in your information. But as I'm going to say over and again, if you do that without putting in the adequate sources and all of your information that you have, you may find yourself on the short end of a stick, because you're basically not going to have any leverage in stopping people from changing it, as long as you are arguing just making changes without getting into the substance of how the family tree works. So here's some general guidelines, and I didn't make these general guidelines up. These are the official FamilySearch general guidelines for using the FamilySearch family tree. First of all, that the content needs to be appropriate. It should also reflect appropriate community standards of modesty and virtue. We're not in there to create controversy with putting in anything that's derogatory or salacious or inactive or defamatory. It needs to be relevant, and it has to be having to do with FamilySearch, and it has to do with the concept of doing genealogical research and reporting and recording genealogy. We'd appreciate it to be heart turning. In other words, it should support the idea that individuals should know and love their ancestors. And this is something that's important, even when you have ancestors that aren't lovable, and some ancestors who you would not think would be deserving of any kind of support or thing. Regardless of that, we need to understand that they came before, and they are the ones that you should be thinking about it and learning about. Also, this is a non-commercial. It should not anything there to promote products or to advertise. And it should not infringe on intellectual property rights. Now, I said a lot about the fact that the information was not copyright protected, but if you start quoting from somebody's written family history, you may very well be violating somebody's copyright. Or if you use a photograph that they have not donated to the FamilySearch website, if it turns out that it's some kind of copyrighted image or photograph, FamilySearch, by the way, will take it down if they're notified. They will simply just copy it. They'll just take it off the FamilySearch website. And that's something that rather happens from time to time. It can't happen very frequently. So it kind of makes it does imply that the users of the FamilySearch family tree will be at least sort of threshold understanding of basic copyright and intellectual property rights. And they should be accurate. So you can't edit out the bad parts and leave them and make them inaccurate or false and misleading. So these are just kind of basic things that we talk about in believability. Now, our society today seems to be rampant with misinformation and information that's partial or misleading or even defamatory. And that's the things we want to keep away from and should not be involved in at all in the FamilySearch family tree. Here's the problem. The major challenge to the family tree itself is data related. So the tree and the substructure and the program work really well. It's a well-designed program, but there's a old adage in computers. It says garbage in, garbage out. That means if you enter inaccurate, incomplete, and even absolutely dead wrong information into the family tree, then that's what everybody sees. That's what comes out of the family tree. And the people who are involved in genealogy at a professional level often become very aggravated with the entries in the family tree simply for the reason that they feel that it's unreliable and can't be considered to be real. It's not something we want to even look at or work with. Well, the problem with that attitude is that there's a whole lot of information with a whole lot of sources and valid historical conclusions in the family tree. And to ignore the family tree today with its more than about 1.5 billion family tree entries is a mistake. All you're going to end up doing is, if you ignore the family tree, is simply spending a great deal of your time duplicating work that's already been done. There's huge sections of the family tree that have no changes, no appreciable changes at all. There's just nothing going on, and there's no changes that they've become very solidified. They're very fundamentally not changeable. Somebody once in a while might add some sources, additional sources or photos or something, but the basic information in huge parts of the family tree are now solidified. And so where are all this other information coming from and going on? So what happens if you keep going back in time? Because as you go back in time, as I mentioned right at the beginning of this, you are going to end up having more and more people who are descendants from these individuals, up to as much as a fairly high percentage of the population of the United States in some instances. For example, the Mayflower passengers, the people who survived the first year of their winters in the northeastern part of the United States. Estimates run as high as 10% of the United States are direct line descendants from these people. So you're going to find out that there are people up there who have substantial descendancies. I'm in a number of families, all of which combined have huge family trees, descendancy family trees. And in my case, that turns into having in excess of 20,000 DNA matches just out of ancestry and my heritage. So, those are the kinds of numbers that you're going to run into. And so someone, as you go back in time, the likelihood that that person is going to change increases. So how does that relate to your grandmother, who's only 2 generations back from you to your mother or father and to your paternal or maternal grandmother? And the answer is that it depends on how many descendants they had. So if their family was very small, like I started out saying, you're being the only child of an only child, then your chances are actually for that your grandmother would be having any changes at all are very, very slight. And should someone come in and make a change to your grandmother that was unacceptable to you because your opinion differed than their opinion as to what it was, or theirs was unsupported and yours is supported, then that gets to the collaborative basis spec of the family tree, where you have to communicate, and there's a way, of course, through the messaging that's in the family tree to actually determine whether or not you're going to go along with or believe or understand what this other person is saying. And perhaps you'll find out that they're right. So I call these people who change excessively on the family tree simply because of their huge number of descendants, revolving door ancestors. And this is a reality. The reality is that because of the way the genealogy is grown, it was totally individual activity for almost 150 years. And so there's been 150 years or more going back in time. Well, there's more than that if you want to keep going back. They were doing genealogy back in the prehistoric time, probably. But the genealogy that we're dealing with on the family tree goes back thousands of years. And some of those people have millions of descendants. And so their opinions about that person back that many years increase. It becomes more and more controversial as you go back in time. And so when somebody comes to me and starts saying, well, my great, 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 great grandmother changes every day. Well, the answer is yeah. Well, what are you going to do? Well, they can't change it. I know what's right, and they don't know what's right. And I'm right, and they're all wrong. Well, maybe. So do you add a source every time? Well, there aren't any sources. Oh, well, then how do you know what you're doing is correct? Good question. Generally speaking, that's kind of the way that these things get resolved because it's a problem. There's a general concern. You would think that you're the only person in the world whose grandmother's changing or whose great-grandmother or great-great-great-grandmother's changing. No, we all live with it. It's a common issue. It's a concern. Is it something that's being done? Somebody's going to do something about? The answer is we've been doing something about it now for the last however many years the family tree's been in existence, the last 15 or 20 years. There's been a constant discussion in the greater genealogical community about how to resolve and, in a sense, make the family tree more reliable without making it impossible to use. So there's lots of trade-offs. If you want people to put in all of their information, you have to give some leeway for the fact that not everybody's going to be a professional genealogist, have it be at the level of a professional genealogist, and they're not going to cite everything correctly. They're not even going to know that they need to put sources in. And it's an education. It becomes an education issue rather than simply wringing your hands and walking away for it. So this comes about, this problem of working with the family tree arises because of the dichotomy between encouraging new users to enter with their basic family information and the need to put some reasonable controls on both the format and the content of the new entries. Because of the way that the family tree began, from the day that they put the database online and opened up what they call the family tree, there were duplicates. There were millions of duplicates. And that was because of the fact that as genealogy evolved, historically going back into the 1800s, into the most current interest in genealogy, that it was a very, 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 very individual pursuit. Nobody was working with someone else. Very unusual that it happened. Everybody was an individual genealogist doing their own individual group of records. And because they did that, everyone who was related to everyone else who was doing that work was creating duplicates. And so the duplicate record issue is a historical record, is an historical issue that goes back at least 150 years. And the question is, can we solve the duplicate effort? Not as long as we allow people to come into the family tree and enter information that they have in their own personal possession. So there's always this trade-off between putting some reasonable controls on the format and content of the old information as well as allowing new information to be added to the tree. Well, why would we want to add a new information to the family tree? The reason is very obvious. We want new information because as people do research and gather more information, we would appreciate all of that information being added. There's no limit to the number of sources, no limit to the number of records and documents and things. Well, there are some limits on the number of documents you can have for one person, but that's a lot into the thousands, and so it's something that's reasonable. Where does the duplication come from? The duplication comes when a person who's unaware or ignoring duplicates adds a name to a family or adds a family that's already on the family tree. The most common problem, of course, is that two people spell the name differently. And when they do a search or they look for it, they can't find anybody with their name. So they conclude that the program helps you conclude that you've got a new person here. But reality comes in when you figure out that with alternate spellings and with more research, you're very, very, very likely to find that the record has been duplicated. Now, I'm personally involved in doing research and adding new people to the FamilySearch family tree. Do I find duplicates? I find duplicates almost consistently when I start adding records to the family tree, when I start adding sources and correcting the information. Because the more information that is gathered on any one individual who is brought into the family tree, the more possibilities of the program itself or the person doing the research will find a duplicate. So I, from time to time, will put in some family names, individuals in a family, and find out that there's just a whole host of duplicates for this family. I call this a firestorm or fire swamp of information. And I can spend hours literally going through and combining and merging and working through of getting the data resolved in that part of the family tree. Now, is that a structural problem? Is that the difficulty? Is it something that we need to start wringing our hands over and becoming upset? Well, if you're going to do that, then you're not going to be able to survive in the environment of a combined unified family tree, because that information is going to have to be resolved at some point in time. Now, what happens when you resolve it and someone comes along and changes it all? Well, the analogy here is always the garden analogy. When you plant a garden, what do you get? Do you just plant it and then nothing, and all your stuff grows beautifully and you never have to touch it again? Or are there weeds? Well, weeds are inevitable. Now, if you lived in the low desert like I did for most of my life down in Salt River Valley and Phoenix and Scottsdale and Mesa, the worst weed was Bermuda grass, and there was almost nothing you could do because it propagated by seeds, by rhizomes, by cuttings, by anything you dropped would grow Bermuda grass. If you watered bare ground, you'd grow Bermuda grass. And so I like to think of the family tree sort of being like that. That when you start adding new things to the family tree, you're inevitably going to find the weeds. And if you don't keep managing it and working on it and putting some effort into it. And so some people say, well, I'm doing more effort managing the tree than I am in expanding or doing new research in the family tree. Well, there's things we need to do to avoid that situation. The grandmother changes that I started off with come about because of a lack of education or negligence due to conflicting information that comes from using usually old information. And the most common one is still, after years and years of being gone, in the sense of not being not being supported or not being acknowledged, is we still have people out there maintaining PAF files. That's personal ancestral files. And the personal ancestral files are just rampant duplication. I can give you a very, very high percentage that if you have a personal ancestral file on some disk or in your computer someplace that you think is something your grandmother did and it was all perfect and we need to use that because this is what she spent her life doing, I can guarantee you that that information is probably duplicated in the FamilySearch family tree because all of that information flowed into the records that went into creating the FamilySearch family tree.
There are a couple of questions that I thought might be timely to answer.
Okay.
One says, can you add quotation marks to the special characters restrictions to prevent them from being added to the name field?
That's a question that I can't answer without knowing more detail. You can, whenever you make a question like that, if you need to help, you can also, anytime the library is open during the week, you can either call in or get in on our virtual help desk and get that. But we need to see what you're talking about. And the answer is anything you put in fields, like a name field, for example, is going to be used by the computer to do searches. And we strongly suggest that you don't do that, that you put any alternates into the other information fields that are available. The record, and this is kind of the general rule, but there are some exceptions in our discussions that I've even had this last week. But the most common way to do this is that the oldest record that we have, the earliest record we have of an individual, the name should be recorded in that way, because we're it's the most accurate. And adding all those like parentheses or quotes or whatever to add nicknames or alternative names is just not a very good practice because it messes up the way that the program searches. There's lots of mistakes made. There's questions here about common problems with merging and incorrect family members being added, etc. This is what I'm talking about, is because this is a collaborative website. It has you have all these people out there and not everybody has the same level of competence. You may think that you're very competent and all these people who are adding things are incompetent. And on the other hand, there may be someone else out there in the family tree who thinks you are totally incompetent because you keep adding things that they don't agree with. So, I mean, it's just sort of like living with a large family that not everybody agrees with. It's not like that. It is a large family that everybody has to live with. Carelessness is really one of the big issues, yes. It's interesting that a lot of the worrying that goes on about the family tree is about new people entering their own information, and that somehow this takes precedent over the entire website. The answer is yes, it does, and yes, it should, because we want to have more users. And there are people who are being born or who are discovering the family tree right now. And it would be wonderful to have their information in the family tree. Now, the basic educational part of it, the educational issues, there are tools out there to to understand and become a good and very competent person in genealogy. And one of the basic tools is the Family History Guide. As many of you may know, that my wife and I are very actively involved in this particular program. So but it's not a commercial program. We're not touting this. It is actually, if you look at this copy from the startup page of the Family History Guide, you'll see that there is a link directly to FamilySearch, from FamilySearch to the Family History Guide. This is used to teach and instruct the volunteer church service missionaries who work with FamilySearch. And it's also now, as of a couple of weeks ago, the official education and resource partner for the National Genealogical Society, for all of their in excess of 450 societies. So this is the major way to go to get structured educational information about the FamilySearch family tree, about doing research, and about how to do research in many other programs. And even if you wanted to, you could not eliminate all the changes because of the family tree, because it's designed to be changed. It would be terrible if it could not be changed. And that was one of the problems that existed with the predecessor to the family tree. Was once that information got in there and it was wrong, it was just in there and there was nothing you could do to correct it. But now that it's able to be corrected, it raises the issues of changing, and that is one of the problems we all have to face. So it is the garden analogy. It is the fact that you really do have to have a way of have to be involved in maintaining it and in a sense, weeding out the information that's incorrect. So here's some suggestions. They seem like they're simple, but they actually work, and they actually cut down on the amount of information. And they actually start with yourself. You need to make sure that if you're involved in the family tree, that you make no changes without citing a source or explaining the reason for the change. And if you did that, it would cut down the number of changes by a lot. It would be a significant correction. The second part of that is monitoring the changes in your part of the family tree. In other words, if you're seeing changes on an individual all the time, then there's a reason for that. And the reason is usually that the person is so far back in time, like here, like Francis Cook, who was one of the original Mayflower passengers, who was born back in the 1500s. We can just expect that a person who has this prominence, this many number of descendants, is going to change a lot. And he may be a revolving door ancestor, which he definitely is. So how do you deal with that? Well, the answer is, until we work through all of the people who think they have good information about this person and educate them, this cannot be stopped. Why doesn't the FamilySearch stop this and just make a person read only, and then you would do? That's a secondary question. And I can assure you that every one of the possible ways that the FamilySearch family tree could be helped has been discussed and is in the process of being discussed by FamilySearch. It's not anything they're not aware of and haven't been aware of since within minutes after the family tree went online. So there are a lot of different kinds of things going on. First of all, there's ways like this thing that says, this is a note. It says, important research has been done. Please read these alerts before making changes. Well, it's my understanding that people disregard that. They don't even read that, and they don't read the sources. If you did read the sources, you wouldn't be adding information. If you look at the change log, you wouldn't be adding information, because you would see all of this has been changed. Your change, which you think is absolutely correct and needs to be done, may have been done 50 times, literally 50 or 100 times before. And people will just keep changing it back because it is not accurate and not correct. So no matter what you think, you have to understand that you're living within a community, and some of the people in the community, even though I mentioned that no one owns it, are very possessive about what they're working with. One of the other ways I suggest is try to collaborate. Now, collaboration works most of the time. When I see somebody changing, someone who is in one of my, say, 6, 7, 8, or 8 generations back, I often will write them a short note and explain why they shouldn't have done it. And many times I get a really good answer back saying, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't understand, and I will be more careful. But when you're back in the free fall with revolving door ancestors, you're probably not going to get many responses back. They're just people who are just going to be making changes because they're right, you're wrong, and they don't put any sources and they just change. So what do you do with the revolving door people? My answer is, don't waste your time on the revolving doors. If they're all revolving, if there's a person and you go in their change log and it just keeps going longer and longer and longer and longer, I would just say, give it some time, let it wait until it slows down or stops. And then very carefully, with a lot of sources and citing, put in the correct information. And then if you want to, you can start defending it. We have chosen to do that in some of our lines. I'm not going to mention the lines because it would not would be helpful from that standpoint. And so basically, you do the defense project on it. One good way to even know whether it's worthwhile to put in your change is to look and see how many changes there's been in the last week on any one person. The one that I think is least helpful at all is to abandon the family tree. And people who say to me, well, I don't even use the family tree because it's unreliable and I can't, they keep changing my information and I don't, so I'm going to go put it on my tree. The answer is, you have just divorced yourself from the greater genealogical community. You're just going to be spending a considerable amount of your time doing duplicate work that many other people have either already done or would be helping you to do, and it's just not productive. So you can, you could come back and argue with me all you want, because I was a trial attorney for 39 years and I'm used to having people tell me I'm stupid and wrong. So, it doesn't hurt me to get into it. But I don't argue. I say, fine, do it. Put your work out on the other word. And if you're going to be, the strategy here with the revolving doors is to have the accurate information in another source, so you don't have to go keep looking it up every time. So here we are, to repeat the same thing. The problem's not the family tree. It's the data and the user's lack of experience and knowledge, and sometimes just crazy. So there's out there. In this case, you're either an educator or an educatee. I decided to make up a good word. And you're either being taught or you're teaching. And I would suggest, if you're in the position of thinking that you know all this information, is start teaching it. Start actually getting online and teaching and helping and supporting people. And I'm going to give you a prediction that as the technology matures and as we get more and more involved in artificial intelligence and the other things that are going on in the greater technology community, that the issues that we have today with the family tree are going to be long forgotten. We'll have a whole new set of issues that we don't even imagine, but we're going to be doing other things than what we're worried about today. So never stop learning and never stop trying. And thanks for watching. Is there any way to make the FH guide, the family history guide, mandatory reading before someone's given access to the tree? We've tried that one too. That's not going anywhere. I don't think mandatory anything is going to work with the family tree. The problem is this is an international family tree and people are putting information in. You may be working in English if you're listening to this in English, and you are probably in the minority of the people now working on the family tree, because the majority of the people that I deal with that work on the tree are speaking Spanish, and they don't even know this English stuff even exists. So I don't get anything about that. They don't have enough involvement with the tree yet to realize that people make changes. I do like the idea of having mentors on the tree. Okay, well, thanks for watching.